Smith History. Discussing history in greater detail. Hello and welcome back to Smith History. Today we're going to be looking at the Second World War, but specifically the battles of the Second World War. Well, although the Second World War was only declared officially in 1939, the fighting really began before that. You see, while many of these governments around the world, they would have had fascist sentiments or secret fascist supporters, but most of them were not openly fascist. These would be the exception of countries such as Germany and Italy. But see, in 1936, a Spanish fascist by the name of General Franco had a coup. The rest of the world would not help the Spanish Republic, but Hitler and Mussolini decided to help General Franco. They did this by providing things such as troops and military resources, such as ammunition, tanks, and aircraft. You could say that this led to Hitler's and Mussolini's economic pact, which was known as the Rome-Berlin Axis. This was made in the same year, 1936. Then in 1938, Hitler invades Austria. And although this once again breaks the Treaty of Versailles, countries such as England do nothing. Next, Hitler demands that Czechoslovakia, which is a new country that was set up after World War I, hand over a region called the Sudetenland. This was located near the German border, and when the government refused, Hitler began to pretend that the Germans in the Sudetenland were being treated badly. He used propaganda to promote this. Furthermore, he threatened the Czech government with violence. The Czech government then appealed to France, who appeals to Britain. But as Britain refuses to help them in a military form, they do draw up an agreement. This agreement states that Hitler can take the Sudetenland as long as he does not invade anywhere else. Hitler agrees to this along with Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister of Britain. He claims when he returns home that he's successfully gotten peace for our time. But in a very short space of time, Hitler has demanded that Poland give up the port of Danzig along with the Polish corridor. This is actually the only separation between Germany and East Prussia. But when the Germans refuse, he instead turns his attention back to Czechoslovakia and invades, even though this is going against the agreement that he has just signed with Britain and France. But Britain and France do not complain. But when then Hitler repeats his demands for the Polish corridor, Britain and France tone changes radically. They declare that if Hitler invades Poland, they will go to war with him. They are not fooled by the propaganda which says that Poland is treating Germans badly. But Hitler is not fazed by this threat of war. One of the reasons being that Hitler has just signed a treaty with Stalin and the USSR. This states that Poland's closest ally, Russia, will not fight against the Nazis. In return, Hitler will not fight any of the Russians. This is called the Non-Aggression Pact, and it was valid for 10 years. This was surprising as Hitler hated communism, and expansion into Russia was part of his expansion plan. In fact, his plan for Moscow was to turn it into an artificial lake. Also included into the treaty, but not made public, publicly available, was that Russia would also receive eastern Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. This would mean that Hitler would not require an eastern front. For Russia, this was the alternative to talks that were being made between Britain and Russia. Then, after German troops dressed in Polish uniforms attack a radio station, Hitler declares war on Poland. So, on the 1st of September 1939, the German armies enter Western Poland, and the Second World War has officially begun. First, the German Air Force bombed Poland, then the Germans sent in large numbers of tanks and soldiers to overwhelm them. This is a new type of warfare called Lightning War. The Poles fought bravely and held out for 17 days. On the 17th of September, Stalin's forces invaded Poland from the east, and the Poles were forced to surrender. Poland had surrendered by the time the Allies had went into action. British and French troops were sent to France's western border with Germany, but while enemy troops faced each other, there was little fighting at this stage. Both sides were using the winter months to build up their strength. You can see this as Germany had been building up its army for war, while France and Britain had armies for defence. And obviously once war begins, supply ships are bombed and you can no longer build weapons at such a high rate. As a result, this became known as the Phony War, but this ended in 1940. The German army launched a lightning attack against neutral countries of Denmark and Norway, and these countries were very quickly defeated. Next, Hitler turned his attention to the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. Within days of invasion, these small countries surrendered to Germany. France was next. France had built a line of forts to protect the border with Germany. This was called the Maginot Line. But as they had left a gap in the Ardennes region, because they had thought that tanks could not get through the thick forests. But they were wrong. The Germans used this weak spot to pour in troops and tanks into France. Another place where the French had not built fortifications along their border was their border with Belgium. The German troops were able to get into France across the Belgian border. The French troops were mainly concentrated on France's western border with Germany. This meant that the French were not prepared for Germany to attack where they did, and the French were forced back when the Germans advanced. At this time, Naval Chamberlain had proved to be a terrible leader, so on the 10th of May he was forced to resign. The new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was determined to resist Hitler at all costs. But unbeknownst to the English, their strongest force was at sea. This was because the German navy was still building itself up. The British retreated towards the English Channel. They were near the port of Dunkirk, and it looked like they would be captured. But, thanks to French troops keeping the Germans advancing slower, and the fact that they managed to be rescued when a British command that all ships were to be made available to rescue them, this operation was known as Operation Dynamo. British ships, trawlers, yachts, and even small pleasure boats crossed the British Channel to rescue troops from the beaches. Despite being under fire from German aircraft, they managed to rescue over 338,000 men in just 6 days. Unfortunately, only 75% of these boats made it home. But this rescue operation made it possible for Britain to regroup, re-strategize, and go on to fight Hitler. The French armies retreated south before the advancing Germans. On the 14th of June, the Germans entered Paris. 8 days later, France was forced to surrender. The Germans then took over northern France and the Channel coastline. This part of France was now ruled from Germany. The rest of France was ruled by the French government under German control. It was based in a small town called Vichy. This became known as the Vichy France. Mussolini stayed neutral when the war began, but when he saw Hitler's victory over France, he joined Germany's side. On June 10th, he invaded southern France, but Mussolini was more interested in conquering North Africa for Italy, and the French managed to stop the Italian advance into France. After France fell, Hitler's next target was Britain. He gave the order for Operation Seeland. This was the code name for a German plan to invade Britain. For this plan to work, the Germans had to gain control over British skies. The British were determined to prevent this from happening. This struggle became known as the Battle of Britain. It was fought between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe. The British had one major advantage over the Germans, and this was crucial, as German aircraft was much better than British aircraft. This was known as radar. Radar gave them early warning of German attacks and allowed them to plan their response. The Battle of Britain began on the 13th of August 1940, with German attacks on radar stations and RAF airfields. British Hurricane and Spitfire fighters fought dogfights with German Me-109s and 110s. Each side greatly exaggerated the number of planes that they shot down. On the 7th of September 1940, the Germans made a huge mistake. They switched their focus from bombing the RAF and attacked London and other cities. Hitler thought that this would make the British people demand that peace be made, but in fact it had the opposite effect. The British people became more determined than ever to defeat Hitler. This feeling of nationalism was scandalised when Queen Elizabeth visited bombed-out sites of London. In addition to this, the fact that the Germans were now focusing on London meant that this gave the British RAF time to recover and rebuild. The Germans were suffering from heavy losses to carry out these bombings, as they were being shot down by anti-aircraft weapons. Therefore, the Germans switched to night bombings. The Germans began to realise that they had lost the battle for air superiority, and Hitler called off Operation Seeland. It is important to realise that while France itself had surrendered, its colonies had not, and they continued fighting. But then, Britain showed a very brutal hand. A small French Navy force had stationed itself in French North Africa. Churchill realised that if these ships were lost, the British would lose their position in the Mediterranean. So, the British demanded the French hand over their ships to the Royal Navy. When the French refused, the British sank 75% of their ships, killing more than 1,300 French sailors. Many people who were now under German rule refused to accept it. Many resistance groups were formed. Members of these resistance groups operated in secrecy. They attacked German troops, spied for the Allies, and stockboated railways used by Germans. There were also powerful resistance groups in Norway and Greece. However, the Germans responded with great brutality to these groups. Many of those captured were tortured and shot. In 1944, a revolt in Warsaw by the Polish Home Army resulted in the Germans completely destroying the city. In 1942, when two Czech resistance fighters assassinated the brutal Nazi leader of Czechoslovakia, the Nazis destroyed an entire village and massacred 172 male inhabitants. The women and children were taken to concentration camps, with less than half of them returning home alive. The bombing of London and other British cities was called the Blitz. It lasted from September 1940 until May 1941. Even the city of Belfast in Northern Ireland was heavily bombed during the Blitz. It was ordinary people who suffered the most. It was about 40,000 civilians were killed. It has taken decades to reach pre-World War II population. By 1941, Hitler realised he was going to defeat Britain and prepared to invade Russia. He was very confident of victory. Stalin still believed that Hitler would honour the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact. He refused to listen to warnings about Hitler's plans. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler's troops invaded Russia. This was called Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers and 10,000 tanks invaded Russia. The Red Army actually outnumbered the Germans, but they were poorly led. Most of its generals had been shot by Stalin's orders in the 1930s. It was no match for Germans, and retracted. The Germans captured millions of Soviet soldiers. For example, after the Battle of Kiev in September 1941, the Germans captured 650,000 men. The German armed forces were divided into 3 army groups. Army Group North advanced in Leningrad and soon surrounded it. For 900 days, or 3 years, they laid siege to the city. The people of Leningrad suffered horribly from cold and hunger. Over 1 million of them died during the siege. But they held out, and in the end the Germans failed to capture Leningrad. Army Group Center reached Moscow in December 1941, but by then the winter had set in and the German soldiers were quite unprepared for the intense cold. Most soldiers died from frostbite rather than Russian bullets. The bad weather gave the Russians time to regroup, and they forced the Germans to retreat from Moscow. Army Group South sent to capture the Russian oil fields near Black Sea. Germans suffered a shortage of oil, and Hitler needed Russian oil. The city of Stalingrad stood in its way. In 1942, Hitler gave an order to attack on Stalingrad. The Russians were determined to hold on to Stalingrad at all costs. There was vicious street fighting, and the German army was trapped in Stalingrad. The Germans found the battle in Stalingrad so tough they called it the Rat War. While the fighting in the city was taking place, the Russians secretly gathered 1 million troops to surround the Germans. In November 1942, the Russians attacked and cut off part of the German army from the rest of the German army. But Hitler refused to allow them to retreat. The Luftwaffe attempted to drop supplies on the troops, but this failed. Many of the German soldiers were dying of starvation. On the 31st of January 1943, this group surrendered. Over 100,000 Germans were dead, and 90,000 were taken prisoner. The Battle of Stalingrad was Hitler's first major defeat, and was a major turning point in the war. The war on the Eastern Front was fought with great brutality. The Russians lost over 20 million in the war. Most of the Germans who lost their lives in the war did so in Russia. The Russians' troops slowly pushed the Germans out of the USSR. By January 1944, the Red Army had driven the Germans back to Poland, but it did not stop there. By mid-1944, the Germans were also advancing into other held territories, such as Romania. America joined the war when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. America had become an arsenal for democracy, supplying Britain with food. Furthermore, America was away from Germany's power. Germany did not have the resources to bomb American factories. And after Mexico refused Hitler's offer of attacking America, the only people who could fight America at home was the Japanese. In the Pacific, the Japanese had conquered parts of China and planned to conquer more areas. The Americans opposed this. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese Air Force had attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. At first, the Japanese were very successful. Their armies conquered Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, as well as islands in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, they also attacked Alaska. The turning point came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. The Americans sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers for the loss of one of their own. After this, the Americans were on the offensive for the rest of the war in the Pacific. They sent an army into North Africa to join the British, who were led by General Montgomery. In 1942, the British strengthened their forces in North Africa and appointed him to lead them. He waited until he had more tanks than the Germans. Then, in November 1942, he launched a massive attack against Rommel's troops and defeated them. Together, the Americans and the British invaded Italy in July 1943. In September 1943, the Italian king dismissed Mussolini and surrendered. In November 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin met in Tehran and made plans to invade France. This became known as Operation Overlord. Stalin was particularly for this invasion as he needed to take pressure off the Red Army in East Europe. This invasion will be the biggest invasion ever planned in history at this date. They decided to land at Normandy. The Germans knew an invasion was coming and erected strong defences. This is what was known as Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But they did not know where the Allies would land. The Allies tricked them into thinking they would be at Calais, which was the shortest route across the English Channel. The invasion force consisted of American, British and Canadian troops. On June 6, 1944, this was called D-Day. Over 6,500 ships and landing craft sailed to Normandy. 10,000 fighter planes and bombers gave the Allies complete control of the air. Airborne troops were dropped behind German lines and they linked up with the French resistance. The Germans fought fiercely and the fighting in Normandy lasted until August, until the Germans were finally defeated. The way to Paris was open. The Germans then surrendered the city on the 25th of August. The Western Allies crossed the River Rhine into Germany in March 1945. In the east, the Red Army entered Germany and reached Berlin by April. The Allies had more men and equipment at this stage. At every night, the Allied force pounded the German towns and factories. In many raids, over thousands of bombs were used. One city was completely destroyed was Dresden. On the night of February 13 to 14, over 135,000 people in the city were killed by Allied bombs. On April 30th, Hitler and his new wife Eva Braun committed suicide in his bunker. The Russians only yards away from his headquarters. On May 7th, Hitler's appointed successor realized that further resistance was pointless, and he ordered a surrender. The following day was VE Day, Victory in Europe. The war was over in Europe. Although some Nazis were put on trial and faced their crimes, many leading Nazis escaped. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the war with Japan continued. After the Battle of Midway in 1942, the Americans captured many islands. It was clear that they were winning, but the Japanese refused to surrender. In a last-ditch attempt to stop the Americans, they formed squadrons of These pilots crashed planes full of explosives onto American ships. By the time the war ended in Europe, Japan's position was desperate. Its navy was destroyed, and every night American bombers pounded Japanese cities. In April 1945, President Roosevelt died. The new president did not want to invade Japan, as his advisors said it would cost millions of American casualties. He decided instead to use a new weapon. It was called the atomic bomb. They'd been working on it for years, and in July 1945, they'd successfully exploded the first one. To save American lives in Truman, they gave the order to use it. On the 6th of August, the bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The bomb was called Little Boy. About 80,000 people died from the explosion, and thousands more was to die in later years from the radiation. Then, 3 days later, on the 9th of August 1945, a second bomb called Fat Man was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. It killed 60,000 people. The Japanese were shocked by the bombings and surrendered. World War II was finally over. Well, thank you for that. If you'd like to find out about Hitler or Mussolini's rise to power, we have Smith History episodes on them too. Thank you and good night. Smith History is an original Smith Co. series. You might also like Smith Facts or Did You Know videos. Next time on Smith History, we look at history. Because that's what it's called. It's called Smith history, which means we look at history.